we've been very fortunate to bring together some experts this morning to help us build capacity and understanding around digital teaching, and in particular, effective as well as engaging digital teaching. And the main purpose of that is really to respond to challenges that all of us have faced over the past year and a half now, when for many of us overnight, teaching had to become an online and digital platform endeavor, and one for which we were not all very well equipped. And so it's really in the spirit of arising to this challenge that we've brought everyone together today. And we have with us two experts, one of our colleagues at Wits, Dr. Ian Moll from the Wits School of Education. He's published quite widely on the Fourth Industrial Revolution and what that means for digital teaching. And we're really grateful to also have his perspective and experience from the South African context, which is not the same as the context in many of our other partner countries. We're also thrilled to have Miné de Klerk with us today from Stellenbosch University's Hybrid Learning Unit. She's particularly passionate about digital teaching characterized by dialogue, or a dialogical kind of character to it. So I think we'll be starting off with Dr. Moll and then moving on to Miné.
Okay, good morning, colleagues. Thank you for this invitation to speak to you and to get some feedback from you on my thinking on many issues. Carmel, thank you in particular to you and your organization for inviting me. So what I'm going to do today is to follow the brief and to share some ideas with you on effective and engaging digital teaching. My purpose today, I think, is simply to pose a few questions, which I think need to be thought about much more carefully in relation to the issue of so-called digital teaching in relation to the future of university education. And there's my first question, by the way. I'm not sure that this notion, digital teaching, is really a meaningful concept that we might want to work with in future. And so in opening up the kinds of questions I want to ask today, I'll actually put that on the table as my first question to think about as we proceed with discussions out of my presentation today. All right, so when I first started thinking about this presentation today, I was working on the understanding that I was going to be involved in a longer workshop than is in fact the case today. There's time restrictions today. And so I did ask Carmel to distribute a paper that I have recently written and is about to be published on ideas relating the Fourth Industrial Revolution to concepts or processes of teaching and learning in educational institutions. And I hope that some of you at least have had a chance to look at that paper, because it constitutes what I would argue is the background, the necessary background to the kinds of debates and discussions that we need to be having about online learning and teaching in a university context. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of those arguments, other than to say there's a very important principle. It's a maxim which floats around the educational context all the time and has for many, many years, in relation to the use of ICTs in the classroom, the pedagogical contextualization and the pedagogical use of technologies in classroom contexts. The technological tail should not wag the pedagogical dog. Now, I'm afraid that given the current ideological context that we operate within, and this is the basic background that I think we need to bear in mind, which is constituted, in my understanding, by the notion of a fourth industrial revolution that we supposedly live in at the moment. And just by the way, those of you who've read that paper that I circulated will know that I think that the notion of a fourth industrial revolution is mythology and a dangerous ideology to be operating with in relation to education in particular. But these concepts that float around about the new normal, for example, or if you like, the new abnormal that we'll live in future, I think are part of a set of understandings and ideas that impose some quite dangerous understandings of teaching and learning on us, whether we operate in universities or even schools and young children's educational institutions. And those concepts at the bottom of the screen, they are just some of the ideas that are floating around about supposedly what we should be thinking about for the future of our universities. The bean counters of our universities, they're the people who now run our universities. And also, I'm afraid to say, much of the senior leadership of our universities seem to have the idea that we are now at a juncture where in future university education will be largely, or at least hugely partially, based on online learning across media like the one we're working with at the moment. And some of the questions I'm posing today about teaching and learning actually need to be considered against that background. But what I do think is that if we approach these questions from the point of view of the psychology of learning in particular as a primary discipline in the area that we work with here, if we approach some of these questions about the future of learning and online learning in universities, some questions and some issues arise that need much more work and much more careful thought in future before we can glibly arrive at an understanding that in our future is an online future in university education. Now, what I've got on screen now is a representation of what are generally acknowledged to be the major theories of learning that influence and give us ideas in some way or another about what online education and online teaching and learning should be about. Connectivism, I'm sure that most of you have heard of that. Connectivism, just by the way, is a version pertinent to the terrain of e-learning of what might broadly be called sociocultural or socioculturalism in relation to theories of learning. Now, my particular view, and I'm not going to develop the argument now other than to assert it as my view, is that both behaviorism and connectivism are non-starters in relation to understanding viable, effective e-learning processes. And basically, the reason why I argue that in my own work and my own understanding of these phenomena is that those two positions, ironically, both deny the existence of an independent, emergent human mind. And I'm quite committed philosophically and in terms of psychological theory to the notion that there is indeed an emergent human mind. And so these other three theories, cognitivism, constructivism, and embodiment theory, or embodied cognition theory, as it's called sometimes, are the three theories that I work within. And what I'm really going to do today is to share some ideas, some questions from those particular theoretical traditions that I think are pertinent to what we're thinking about today. All right, so an overview. And as I said to you, I'm not going to go into detail of the theoretical issues. I'm simply going to spark some questions. But I'm going to be working with three ideas that come, as you see, from those different theoretical traditions. From embodied cognition, embodiment, the idea of the presence of the body in learning, the psychological presence in this instance. From cognitivism, or more specifically within it, neuropsychology, the importance of working memory and cognitive load in relation to teaching and learning online. And then finally, from the constructivist tradition, I want to talk about how meanings are constructed, connections and systematic relationships between concepts in disciplinary perspectives, or what we might call activity-based learning in a university context. That's the particular area I want to work with there. And my intention, as I said, is just to share some ideas about each, to try and put them together in a particular way, to make connections between them in some way or another. And then hopefully just spark some questions for future discussion if you're interested, if other people want to work with this. All right, so let me start then to talk about embodied cognition theory. Okay, I suspect my slides have jumped around here, so let me go here first. I seem to have lost a slide. Anyway, no problem. What I'm talking about here is embodied cognition theory. And the important thing that embodied cognition theory puts on the table for us is the understanding that when we are engaged in interaction with each other as human beings in the normal courses of everyday life. Yeah, this is the slide I should have had there. Sorry, I'll go back to the others. Embodied cognition theory being concerned, amongst other things, with what I would want to call the visceral aspect of communication. Now, here are just some images which I think refer to things that are quite clear to us in our communications with other people. The first has to do with the importance of facial expressions and facial movements. Now, when human beings relate to each other, and we know this from evolutionary psychology in a number of different ways, when humans relate to each other, our observation and our engagement with each other's faces are crucial, and in particular things like eye contact and expressions with the mouth are important in communication between human beings, fundamentally so actually, in the way that human beings engage with and share meanings and understandings with each other. And these images, I think, just make it quite clear that we work with our mouths, we work with our eyes, and we work with our hands in communicating with other people. And if you look at yourselves as I share with you now, as you communicate with other people, you will know that you are working very carefully and very clearly often with hand expression, facial expression, etc. So that's what I'm terming the visceral aspect of communication. And of course, what we face when we engage with e-learning processes, okay, with online teaching and learning, is the possibility of losing those kinds of visceral communications and visceral contacts between human beings. And it's quite a serious issue. Now, the way that very often e-learning advocates and online learning advocates deal with this issue is to talk about what they call the social presence of teachers and learners in online learning spaces, okay? To find some way of using that online learning environment to compensate for the lack of visceral engagement between people in normal human interactive context. And one way of doing that, of course, is when we set up courses online, we introduce ourselves as the lecturers in a course, etc., etc. And here's just a little screen grab from one of the courses that I'm engaged in teaching. But, and if you look at these two images now here in the middle of the screen, that one, the 9 or so bubbles, there's many more actually in the tab below. The people who are involved in our Teams meeting or our Zoom meeting or whatever are represented to us in that way. And I think you will all know from your experiences of online learning that students are often very reluctant to turn their cameras on. And the bottom image, of course, is a standard, if you like, tutorial context in which clearly those visceral forms of communication that I talk about are available and ongoing in that situation. And this issue of students not being interested in turning their cameras on, for me, has become very much of concern in considering the future of online learning. In research that I'm engaged in with my colleagues here at the School of Education about what we've learned from our online teaching experiences, is that students generally give a number of reasons for refusing, in fact, in many, many cases, to turn their cameras on, at least while they speak. And as I've suggested to you, that lack of camera images is quite serious in terms of this visceral issue in relation to teaching and learning. And very often students say things like, I'm not dressed for the occasion, I haven't done my hair properly, I'm not, etc., etc. But there's also a deeper issue, I think, which is that students engage partially with teaching and learning processes through this distancing of themselves by the fact that they don't switch their cameras on. And that issue, I think, is something that we need to think quite carefully, because what it leads to ultimately, I think, is a set of teaching and learning practices in which students say something like, please make sure that you record the session and send us the recording so that I can look at it later. And then, of course, what they do is they glean nuggets of wisdom and pearls of wisdom from what is said by people in that thing. And it becomes a very narrow conception of isolating particular ideas and recording them as the core of the learning process that is produced by e-learning environments. And so for me, what I'm suggesting to you here, and here's the second question, my suggestion is that In fact, in the online processes of learning and teaching that we experience through things like Zoom and Teams, we're actually losing a whole fundamental dimension of teaching and learning that we will regret if we simply go to standard, wholly online teaching and learning as the norm in universities in future. All right, let me now go to cognitive load theory. What do we learn from this particular perspective? And we're talking here about the applications and implications of neuropsychology in the terrain of understanding, teaching, and learning. And here the key issues are, when concerned with the way that the human mind or the brain, and they're interchangeable concepts generally in this perspective, when we're concerned with their kinds of understandings and inputs, we understand working memory and its limitations. Now, working memory is that part of our thinking process that is conscious and deliberate, that is within the terrain of our consciousness. And the fact about human beings is that we have very, very limited capacity in our working memory, okay? We can only hold between 3 and 7 elements or units of information, if you like, within our working memory at any point in time, which means in effect that our working memory can be very easily overloaded. Okay, and the concept that comes to us from cognitivism that we need to think about quite carefully in relation to online learning is the idea of cognitive load and the overloading of the cognition of our learners by the way we present things online. Now, I'm going to work with some examples from PowerPoint here, and clearly this applies both to the use of PowerPoints in online learning environments, but also in everyday teaching learning situations, lectures, for example. But there's a particular importance in relation to thinking about PowerPoints because the norm, in fact, in online learning that we've moved to because of this very rapid transition is for people to use narrated PowerPoint slides, for example, in online presentations, or to use PowerPoint presentations in the way that I'm doing now. And the question, of course, is what happens to PowerPoints when there is no embodied learning taking place at the same time? What goes on? What is actually the situation that we need to think about? And there are some quite serious issues. Now, I'm going to just play you very quickly an extract from a PowerPoint presentation that is in the public domain. It's on YouTube. It's an example of what I would call a very bad or a very poor use of PowerPoint slides in presenting information. And I'm just going to play that extract to you now, and then I'm going to come back to it and talk about it in relation to cognitive load theory.
Now, you may have seen his theory called a few of these other terms: the cultural historical theory of cognitive development, social culture perspective, and the social interaction theory of cognitive development, and finally the Constructivism theory. But unfortunately, his works were not widely known until in 1953, after Stalin died. His manuscripts were able to be published, and lucky for us, his wife and his daughter hung on to those and kept them in good condition until they were able to be published. And then it wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that his theories became popular in the US as they replaced Piaget's cognitive development theory. Now, a few differences between Piaget and Vygotsky was that Piaget really emphasized cognitive development based on internal influences, while Vygotsky focused on external influences such as social interaction. Piaget really focused and said that the power engine for cognitive development was the mismatch between prior knowledge and current experience, or in other words, the tension between one's beliefs and one's experience. Now, to review a few of the guiding principles behind Vygotsky's theory, he said that all children and humans experience continuous development. There are no set stages. So it begins with birth and ends with death, where Piaget said that development ended at adolescence. Vygotsky said that learning is possible before a true set development. He also said this was a collaborative process between social interaction between an adult per se and a child. So it's a collaboration between two people and not one-sided. He also stated that the social and psychological processes are equally important and mutually influential. Between Piaget and Vygotsky, they both strive to eventually characterize cognitive development. What is cognition? We can say that cognition is defined by thinking, or the rational thought devoid of complicating emotions, wishes, and will. Essentially, it's a manipulation of ideas inside our human brains. And this is based on spoken language as part of a social process, both informal and formal. And this speaks to the saying that I'm sure we're all familiar with, that children are sponges. They are essentially taking in everything around them, both socially and environmentally, and internalizing that into cognition, or their way of thinking. Cognition has been achieved. The next goal is higher order thinking. And this is essentially more complex cognition that is based on prior knowledge and a set of lower order skills, and then the ability to recognize a problem, uncertainty, or question or dilemma that a child is faced with. And then the goal with higher order thinking is to be able to explain or make a decision or a performance based on the set of problems that they are set with. So this is all possible because humans have a large cerebral cortex to make cognition possible, but the ability to engage that capability is only learned through social experience or the culture around them, according to Vygotsky.
All right, now I've suggested to you that that's a very poor PowerPoint presentation. It's a very poor use of this kind of medium. In online learning in particular, because of the absence of any other kind of reference points in communication. Now, what cognitive overload theory shows us, if you look at a slide of this kind, and this is how you assess cognitive overload in any context. We're interested in questions of the amount of information that is being conveyed on each slide, the number of information processing channels that are being used by that presenter, and the degree to which the teacher draws attention to the salient features of task in that context. And in relation to this particular slide, it's quite clear that it's very poor because there is too much information being communicated on each slide. There are too many information processing channels being used, and the teacher is in fact failing to draw the attention to salient features of task, learners to those task performances. And this relates to, first of all, the generally understood information processing notion, that there are three channels of communication that are always at use. In other words, there are three channels through which information is being processed in the brain of the learner as she learns and works with this information. And I've called those visual 1, visual 2, and auditory, okay? Three different channels in which information is being communicated. Now, in these particular slides, there is very high use of visual 1 textual information. In other words, there's lots of words on each slide. And in fact, they're haphazardly presented. They're not related to each other in any way by images, by connections that are being made on the slide. There is simply too much text. And that in itself overloads the learner as she engages and works with that particular slide. In relation to the use of images in these slides, actually there is very little, as I think is clear if you think back to them. So there's no graphics, photographs, etc., that are being used there. But there is some use of images, for example, that sequence of arrows signifying progress in the particular theory. And of course, the use of bullets is a visual image that is intended to structure information. And then there's, of course, a very high auditory level, okay? And what is happening in these slides is the presenter is reading the slides directly to the audience, word for word, pretty much, as she goes through them. And there is very high auditory information processing required by each one of these slides. Oh, sorry. Now imagine that one of those slides also had a lot of visual imagery of this kind in it. And by the way, this is very much the norm amongst students that I engage with when they present PowerPoint presentations, and amongst many colleagues, I'm afraid to say.
Now, to review a few of the guiding principles behind Vygotsky's theory, he said that all children and humans experience continuous development. There are no set stages. So it begins with birth and ends with death, where Piaget said that...
All right, so I think you're getting the picture there. There's lots of images being introduced there onto the slide, which are supposedly connected to the content. And if you spend quite a while thinking about each one of them, you might in fact perceive some of those contents. But they are not being conveyed properly by the presenter of that slide, those PowerPoint slides. And thus they create a very high level of visual to image information processing. And each one of those are very high, and each one of them unfortunately creates cognitive overload. And the general understanding that we have from cognitivism, from neuropsychology and its understandings of the working memory capacities of people, is that you should not be working in any case with more than 2 information processing channels, because if you do that, you are automatically producing cognitive overload. It is very difficult for any human being to concentrate on 3 information processing channels at any point in time. You can work with 2 very productively. You can work with what is called germane cognitive load, which increases your abilities as a learner. But of course, those 2 need to be explicitly connected to each other. And that, of course, brings us to what I'm going to call a 4th information processing channel, which is the problem of the situation in which the presenter of the PowerPoint slide reads the text that is on screen to the audience. And I think, again, if I suggest to you that this is very much the norm in the way that very many people work with PowerPoint slides, you will know that I'm correct. And the problem there, of course, is that one of the things you are automatically doing, you cannot avoid it as you engage with those slides, is you are checking all the time to see whether the reader is reading the text correctly. You're checking that she is correct, and you're reading and listening and reading and listening, and you're checking out whether or not she's reading correctly. And that, unfortunately, is a 4th channel of information processing, and it increases the likelihood of cognitive overload in that kind of situation. So this, I think, is one of the central lessons that we need to take from cognitive information processing theory, cognitivism. And it's something that needs to be thought about much, much more carefully in relation to our practices as online educators. And unfortunately, in my experience, it is something that often undermines the kind of thing that people are trying to do in online learning. They simply produce too much cognitive overload in the way that they present information. When constructivism comes along as a different kind of theory of learning, and what it does is it gives us a different way of thinking about the way that we use slides.
Ian, sorry, I'm going to give you 3 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. And what I've done now is I've put some representations on about the way we might use slides in a constructivist perspective. And what we're trying to do here is, rather than read the slides or overload people with contents of slides, we're trying to present them with slides which become objects of discussion, okay? So the lecturer comments on the slides and discusses them critically is the crucial issue. And an invitation is made to learners as well to engage with slides by discussing them as learning objects. And I'm going to just put up on screen, without talking about them in any detail, different ways of using PowerPoint, which is basically to set up objects for discussion. And one thing that the teacher does is, of course, discusses these particular objects and attempts to draw the attention of learners to salient features of what's on the slide. Okay, and there are many ways of doing that, okay? This, by the way, I'd just like to point out is a way of working with long quotations, where you isolate particular concepts and look at the way that concepts are integrated and work with each other in a particular piece of text. And of course, then you're drawing attention to salient features. There's also ways of working with PowerPoint slides that represent concepts in images of this kind. This was an attempt to work with understandings of causality, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's my presentation, people, and I trust that it gives you some ideas in thinking about how e-learning and online learning might become more engaging than actually seems to be the case at the moment in the environment in which we work in often. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I think particularly the ending with sharing these very practical, user-friendly examples will be quite useful to all of us. And I'm going to remind and encourage everyone to either jot your questions down in the chat or remember them so that after Miné's presentation, when I open up the floor, we can share all of your questions on Ian's presentation as well. Having said that, Miné, I think we can hand over to you at this point.
So, I'm going to do my presentation in two parts. One is the more conceptual part, and the one is more on the practical. Now, on the conceptual part, I'd like to focus on the notion of the virtual classroom and actually why this is problematic. And then I'll suggest a bit more of an alternative metaphor, and then I'll link that to more practical suggestions. So let's start with the conceptual. Now, last time you logged into your online course, whether it was on your learner management system at your university, which might be a Blackboard or Moodle, or perhaps just logged onto an online course, have you noticed the terminology we use when we think around an online classroom? It denotes a physical embodied space, and this is what Ian also referred to. We use words like an address bar, an address meaning a place, a site home, a home page. We log in through a door, a portal. We might bookmark a page or click back using what we call breadcrumbs. It's those little titles at the top of a screen. We navigate, we browse, and we move through these different rooms. And all of this suggests the idea or the notion of a embodied physical space, which might seem to make us feel at home, but yet why don't we feel at home in the online space? There's a lot of, and what Ian actually suggested now, a lot of tension the moment we try and engage online. And it might be surprising because especially before COVID, we heard a lot of techno-optimistic terminology used around online learning. Things like it'll be a really social place for optimal engagement. It's flexible. You can learn in your own time. It'll widen access. We'll reach new markets. So let's take those concepts and just quickly break them up. Firstly, the notion of a space for engagement. Now, we know that we're born hungry for faces. As Ian also mentioned, we rely heavily on faces to understand one another. But the problem is, it might seem oddly intimate to engage like this, like we're doing now, but it also feels inadequate, right? Because when I'm looking into my webcam, I cannot see anybody else's faces. I see my webcam. When I look down to see your faces, it doesn't seem like we're making eye contact. And we miss something very important, which relies in the eye. We know through extensive research that we as humans are the only animals with a very wide white around our irises. And it's assumed we've evolved that way so that we can communicate. So I can kind of gauge through eye contact when you are distracted, when you are engaged, when you're perhaps being dishonest. And even if you're standing in front of a classroom with a big lecture hall, and your students' eyes are no bigger than a full stop on a page, you will still be able to gauge those micro transitions, the kind of three-dimensional typography of their face that subtly changes, that helps us to communicate. So the problem with online learning is even if we switch on our cameras, it's still very much a disembodied experience. Now you might say, okay, what about if we don't need to learn through synchronous video calls like we're doing now? If you look at something like a asynchronous or self-paced exercise, such as a forum discussion where students can use text-based communication to engage in dialogue in their own time, This was from a course which, when we looked at it afterwards, we were very excited. Oh, there were 3,000 posts between the 80 students. We thought it was very dialogic, very engaging. But if you drill down and you really look at it, you realize our metrics are failing us. It is not about who posts the most. If you look at the who is replying here, it is one tutor and it's one reply all the time. And in my interview with her afterwards, she said they came, they post, they left. She called it a monologic space rather than a dialogic classroom, saying she felt completely burnt out because she just replied to students and they never took the dialogue further. There was no peer engagement and they probably didn't even read one another's posts. So is that really engagement? Then the issue of flexible time use. We always say it's a flexible use of our time. We'll be able to learn synchronously like we're doing now in real time, but also asynchronously. A recent study though really summed it up very, very nice. And I'm willing to share the article with you afterwards around the issues with online and flexible learning though. The biggest one being the lack of intermissions. If you stand up after a lecture and you start chatting with your peers, maybe you just get into your body and you move to the next classroom, that is a very important intermission that allows for reflection and just a kind of break in terms of mental energy. Now you don't have those intermissions. We're jumping between calls, we're maybe jumping between exercises online, and we're having to manage tools while we do this. And this requires even more mental energy. We might have low bandwidth. The moment I start breaking up, that distracts you even more. And of course, it's an issue of information volume. When we log on to the online classroom, we see all these posts, we see everything that has happened kind of compounded, and that is even more cognitive load. And finally, the wonderful promise of reach. We will reach so many students. This will be, we always say at Stellenbosch University, we're in Africa for Africa. It sounds wonderful, but it also heightens the issues that divide us. And with that, I'm referring to a student that needs to start learning online and expressing themselves in a very visual text-based environment using, let's say, their second or third language where everything is recorded. It's very jarring. It's heightening issues around demographics, cultural issues, how we express ourselves online. It might be misinterpreted. And also the digital divide, access to mobile phones, all these things are made salient the moment we learn online. So to summarize my little conceptual part, why do we not feel at home? It's because there's a tension. There's this cognitive dissonance where we feel, yes, it's supposed to be really intimate and social, but it's completely disembodied. So it feels to us that it is messing almost with our sense of place. It also feels, yes, self-paced and flexible, but it's also more time consuming and taxing and causing fatigue. So it is jarring in terms of how we understand time. And it should be able to allow us to reach more students, yet it poses new barriers. So it puts a question mark over the notion of access. And it's these concepts of place and time, what we call the chronotype, which is our understanding of place and time, or the language we use to describe place and time. That is how we understand the world. So if you mess with those concepts, it's immensely jarring for us. And this is why I'd like to suggest we rethink the metaphor of the virtual classroom, because a virtual classroom suggests a physical place where you can go into and meet someone at a specific time. But yet what we know is in the online space, spatial boundaries are blurred. We can occupy multiple times and places at the same time. So this metaphor is not really serving us. And if you will allow me, I'd like to suggest for a couple of minutes that we bulldoze the idea of the virtual classroom and adopt a new metaphor. Now, with a bit of a brainstorm with my team, we came up with something new, and I'm going to link that with some practical suggestions. Okay, so I'm going to structure this again around place, time, and access, starting with place. Where do I teach? Before COVID, we all spoke about the online library. You would think you can just upload all your online learning materials, and then we treat it as a static repository. And we know that's problematic. It's not very engaging. Then we started thinking around the virtual classroom, but that's also problematic for the aforementioned reasons. Now we can think about online learning for what it really is, the online space, your LMS, which is just a bunch of HTML code floating in the digital cloud somewhere, but that feels like the matrix. It's very confusing. We need a metaphor. We're visual creatures. So what I would like to suggest is the notion of a virtual desk or an online study space. This is a space that you set up for your students, for your student success. It's not a classroom. You'll not be there all the time. They're not expecting you to be there all the time. It can be quite an isolating and lonely space, but it's lighter and more flexible in terms of how you set it up. And it's something that you very regularly have to rearrange. So if you would allow me to continue with this metaphor, let's look at what's on the desk. Firstly, a calendar. We tend to, in our first lectures with students, give them a course overview, a module overview. But we forget that if you think about this as a virtual desk, that they have quite a few virtual desks, different modules that they have to access. And there's a lot of mental energy that goes into trying to see the learning journey all the time. So you want to make it very clear for them where are they going and their learning outcomes, and make that very visible for them. But where we kind of drop the ball, I think, is leaving it there. What we forget to do is the fact that they also need a weekly diary. This is guiding the students by sharing just-in-time information in the online space about what to do when they sit at that desk for that next bit of period, because it's a lot of information that they suddenly have to gauge. When they sit in the lecture hall, immediately you orientate them about what we're going to do, and that's what you need to do when they log on, whenever that is. Then, in terms of your learning material, firstly, we tend to want to overload students with learning material on the online space because we can share lots of links and videos and wonderful other things, because we can put it up all there. But your role, remember, is to curate information, whether it's text-based, video, audio, and then make it very explicit why it's linked to their learning outcomes, help them apply that in a way to engage in dialogue around it, to contextualize it. And once you've curated that information, to organize it in the way that they can work through it. The more clearly it's organized, the less time and anxiety they spend clicking around trying to find out what to do next. So also don't be afraid of what one of our designers, Sarah Cullen, always calls a rhythm online. That's kind of cohesion, using the same pattern, whether it's introduction, a lesson, then assessment, that's okay. At least it means every time they come to the desk, they know where things are. Then do make it manageable. There's lots of research around this, and it can be a webinar on its own around why it doesn't work to just record a 45-minute session. And I think Ian demonstrated that very, very well. You need to, it doesn't mean you have to lighten your information or the content you share, or share less with them, but you have to break it up into manageable chunks. They do not stay as engaged. They do experience a lot of fatigue if you give them one long recording. And you can get quite creative in how you do this. So as an example, here is a lecture that took a very long audio podcast. It was broken up into different pieces. You can see it on the right there. And then the audio was accompanied by little short text summaries. And just a note, audio is king in the online space. It's shown again and again that it's more valued than visuals or video quality. But once again, that's a webinar on its own. And then finally, don't forget that information that you would just say offhand in the classroom. Why are we doing this? By when do you need to do it? How will you do it? How do you hand this in? It's those what my colleague Firos, who's also on the call, always calls the very importance of instructional text. Here you can see the lecture explained why the students have to do this tutorial, that they cannot use a calculator. He added a little voice note that explained even further, made it very clear where they need to click. And it's those little post-its that you put on your desk that makes a world of difference. It helps to guide the students. It creates a safe space for them that they can really focus on the learning material. So we looked at where we teach, this desk. Now we're looking quickly at time. When do I teach? On the one hand, you don't want this to feel like a lonely space, that every time they log on, it feels isolating. There's very little activity. You're never there. But on the other hand, you cannot be online all the time. So we want to find that sweet spot in the middle, that's a blend of face time, contact time. And here I'm referring to what we're doing now, real-time engagement. Obviously, ideally, it would be great if it can be on campus now and then, but sometimes it can't, and then it's real-time engagement, and let's call it footprints. I'll explain what I mean. FaceTime, online synchronous engagement. If you look at your course calendar, here's an example. Highlight for yourself, when will you engage with your students? When will you have a webinar? Are they prepared for that? So it's not just an online lecture, but a place where they can really engage with one another. So you have to do a bit of homework before. You can't overload them with too much real-time engagement. It's not, especially in the African context, feasible. It requires high levels of connectivity and data. So also work in informal live sessions. It can be as simple as a chat room where you're online every 2 weeks for an hour and they can pose a question. So you're balancing that formal lecture style with something more informal. But that is just the FaceTime, the real-time engagement. What lectures tend to forget is the footprints. And this is traces you leave at that virtual study desk to show them you've been there. You don't have to reply to each post, but it can be as simple as posting a voice note saying, I looked at your forum discussions this week, it was really interesting, and highlighting a few. Or it can be something as simple as a reminder of your test at the end of this week. Yes, interesting reading. Just replying to 1 or 2 posts, even any trace to show them every time that visit that desk that you are watching, you are engaging, even if it's not in real time. It really sends a message that this is also a caring space, a community for learning, even though it's completely simulated, of course. And then I'm almost done, Carmel. The final issue is that the issue of access. So we spoke about time and place, but what about, how do I open the door to this virtual desk? And here you have to understand who you teach. We know, and this is a topic also completely on its own, that we need to understand our students. We need to understand their context, the level of Wi-Fi connectivity, what devices they have access to, and we need to adjust accordingly. But in addition to that, we have to understand that it's not just about their access to a mobile phone with data. It's also about their digital literacy in terms of online learning. They need to know how to engage with one another online. They need to be on board in terms of netiquette or online etiquette, and you can model that for them. They need to be helped to think around, how can I prepare for self-regulated, self-paced learning, something that might not be used to at all. I think none of us are, and it is more challenging. So it's a blend of the technical and pedagogical and just kind of personal. It's an additional layer to your teaching that you cannot forego. And then finally, make them feel welcome. When they open that door to this virtual desk, it needs to feel like a space where not only you said welcome, maybe during your first webinar, but a place where they feel there's a community between the students. You need to encourage them to also leave footprints for one another, whether it's a quick reply to a forum post or just an introductory exercise where they share something about themselves, whether it's a picture or a line, or just bring their identity into the space. It will never be as social and as community building as the face-to-face environment. But we know there's a strong correlation between the sense of learning community and academic success. So my final slide, where to start, and the 3 most simple tips. Firstly, once you're ready to do this and you've made this mind shift about how online learning is actually a completely different beast to face-to-face, start with what you have, whether it's a PowerPoint or reading, it doesn't matter. It's more about how you understand this new space, how you structure things, how you set it up for the learner, that's more important than how high tech and splashy your things really are. But do keep in mind, I mean, Ian's wonderful tips around good presentations as well. That said, there will always be a technical layer. You always have to ask for help. For this presentation, 4 of my colleagues brainstormed with me a bit. I have the privilege to work with learning designers that have immense experience between the pedagogical and technical, but I ask them for help all the time. We have a kind of a failing forward philosophy. And we're also curious about other people and their experiences. So not just the courses we teach, but what our lecturers that we work with teach. You can look at our website on the testimonials. We ask lecturers about the good, the bad, and the ugly, also what they found challenging, and learning continually from that. And then finally, welcome the discomfort. You and I will never be an expert in terms of online learning. Technologies are changing, the way we think about things are changing. It's a space where we'll never feel embodied. It will always feel at a distance. It's actually always going to be somewhat jarring. But once you've become used to that discomfort, then you can kind of muddle through and find a way where you can continue to improve your practice. And with that, thank you so much. And I welcome any feedback and suggestions or other metaphors for online learning.
Thank you so much, Miné. That was really, really informative. And I particularly like the point you ended on about not being afraid to turn to others for help, because I think it really is only through that kind of knowledge sharing that we're all going to figure this out, because we're really just learning together and sometimes feeling around in the dark. And I think that kind of knowledge sharing is one of the most exciting things about the academic environment. So why not apply it to this new space that we're all trying to learn about?